studying tonight in 1 Kings chapter 1. About a year or so ago, we studied together the United Kingdom under Saul and David. And we looked at the first part of Solomon's reign, where Solomon honored God early in his life, and he continued to do great things. I mean, when you talk about the glorious kingdom during the United Kingdom period, it was under Solomon. And God richly blessed Solomon, but then Solomon turned his back on God, didn't he? And ultimately the kingdom which God had so blessed under his father David and for a period of time under Solomon, eventually following the rebellion of Solomon, the kingdom would be divided. And so what we're going to do during this particular quarter is to consider the divided kingdom. It's been a while since we've studied the divided kingdom, and I look forward to this particular study. We're not going to do a verse-by-verse study of 1st and 2nd Kings. If we do that, we'll be here for a long, long time. Not that as a teacher I could ever compare myself to Franklin Camp. I do remember what Don McWhorter told me many years ago about the beloved Camp. He said that he followed him at East Gadsden, I believe it was, many years ago, and the elders of the congregation said to Brother McWhorter, said, "We love Brother Camp. He's a scholar. We've learned much under him, but said, we're not sure we want you to continue his series style of preaching." And so Brother McWhorter inquired a little more about what they meant. He said, well, for example, Brother Camp had been preaching from Galatians, and said when he retired, he had gotten to Galatians chapter 2, verse whatever. And Brother Don said, well, how long had he been in Galatians? And the brethren said, about 3 years. Well, we're not going to spend 3 years in this book, or we will neglect a lot of other Bible, and so we don't want to do that. But I want us to go back for just in time before this rebellion of Solomon occurred, just to get the background of what was happening. Remember, David, this is as 1 Kings begins, David is getting old. And we don't need to be offended by David getting old as he nears 70. Some of you are thinking, I'm well beyond 70 and I don't feel old. But the Bible says David was getting old. Well, it also says Solomon in his old age, and he was in his 50s, all right, when the Bible said that about him. So David's getting old. He's physically in poor health. And he is still, of course, the king. But we want to consider for just a moment how it was that Solomon became king, because he would not have likely been the king, given the fact that David had many sons older than Solomon. And David was the father of a multitude of sons. Only one daughter is mentioned. Remember her, Tamar, who was violated by her brother, Amnon, her half-brother. And, of course, Tamar was the sister of Absalom. And so Tamar is mentioned, but no other daughters are mentioned. But the sons, many of them are mentioned. Now, just for a review, as we think about some of the sons of David, remember names like Amnon, Gilead, Absalom, Adonijah, Shephatiah, Ithream, all born while David was in Hebron. And then his harem would keep expanding. He'd come down to Jerusalem, and there were concubines to David. They bore him many sons. But then there was Bathsheba. Now Bathsheba, of course, is mentioned in a particular account of David that is very sordid in nature. But Bathsheba would become the mother of 4 of David's sons, most likely Solomon being the youngest of those sons. And so she had 4 sons that she bore, and these sons were sons of David, and Solomon would one day be king. Now, If Absalom and Amnon are dead, and most likely Gilead is dead too, then Adonijah, of course, thinks that he is the one that should become king. You've studied about royalty and monarchies, how that works. It usually goes to the next eldest child, but Adonijah is not to be the king. All right. I'm more familiar with British history, having followed the British royal family for many years, studied British history in college. In my effort to obtain a history degree, I love British history. But the Queen of England, of course, is 92, and her ancient son, who's about 70, is supposed to succeed her one day. We'll see. But if the Queen said, no, he will not succeed me, rather my youngest son Edward will succeed me, we find that rather strange, because it always goes according to age. And just a few years ago, it was the oldest sons, and then the daughters, regardless of where they fell in line. The law of primogenitors changed, however, and now I believe the daughters are treated just like the sons in this is the 21st century. But Solomon is the one who's to become the king. Now, here's what's different from the monarchies like that are in England or in Japan. Japan, still, a female cannot sit on the chrysanthemum throne. But what's happening in this United Kingdom where David is the king? God is supreme, isn't it? And God says Adonijah is not going to be the king. In fact, the one who will be the king is Solomon, who is one of the much younger sons of David. Now, didn't God always say He'd choose the king? He didn't want them to have a king. But long before the United Kingdom ever was established, God already said, I'll choose who's going to be the king. And I'll also dictate what kind of man he'll be. And if he doesn't follow me, then he will not be blessed, and the kingdom will not be blessed. And obviously, when God said, issued a warning long before the United Kingdom ever came to existence, if these things happen, if they are violated, there will be no more kingdom. And what happened? Solomon violated those things that God said were not to happen. Well, Solomon is to be king, and that's because God said he's going to be king. God loved him. God appreciated his character. And not only that, David loved God, and David said, if God wants Solomon to be king, that's who'll be king, right? Well, who do you think is most supportive of this idea of Solomon, or one of her boys, becoming king? Bathsheba, right? Bathsheba. And so it is that Bathsheba is going to find out through Nathan that there is a rebellion going on by Adonijah. Adonijah thinks, hey, my older brothers are dead, I'm going to be king. And so here we're going to see God particularly interfering with the affairs of men. God said Adonijah's not going to be king. There's a rebellion going on. Who's helping him in this rebellion? Why, Joab's part of it, right? It's Zadok's part of it, the priest. And so you've got all of these who had been loyal to David now getting behind Adonijah. But word comes to Bathsheba. And the word is that Adonijah is setting himself up to be king. And so somebody's got to go in there and speak to the aged king. And who would go into him? His beloved, Bathsheba. Now, when we think about the character of Solomon, we've talked about already, at a previous time in class, about Solomon and his beautiful prayer that he prayed to God, asking not for wealth, but for wisdom, and the prayer pleased God. And we also would note, of his wisdom displayed, such as with the two harlots and the child that was born, and we know about his building of the temple, and likewise the Queen of Sheba coming and witnessing all of that. That's where we ended our last study. Things are going to change in the life of Solomon, sadly, but what brought about this sterling character in King Solomon? Well, somebody might say, behind this great character of Solomon must have been his mother, but I don't really think so. I don't believe that Bathsheba was really noted as being a virtuous woman, was she? You got to keep this in mind about Bathsheba. While David was guilty of committing adultery, so was Bathsheba. And Bathsheba, I do not believe, was in any way forced to do what she did. In fact, one thing that Bathsheba was doing was publicly displaying herself, wasn't she? And I believe she knew when the king would appear. And we know she had a faithful husband, didn't she, in Uriah. And so David, he didn't do right. He saw Bathsheba. She was obviously a beautiful woman. And he sent for her, and she came to him. There doesn't seem to be any indication that David forced her to do what she did. And you know, she also had to fulfill what the Mosaic Law taught concerning purification, just like David did. Now, if she'd been forced to do something, she wouldn't have been required to do that, would she? So what I'm saying is Bathsheba was not noted as a Proverbs 31 kind of woman. And yet, God forgave David and Bathsheba. And Uriah was dead. And David brought Bathsheba into the household. And he evidently loved Bathsheba. And Bathsheba then was the one who would bear these sons to David, including Solomon. Now, when you study 1 Kings chapter 1, here's what you're going to notice. As David gets older, Bathsheba is there to guide him and direct him. What we're talking about is Bathsheba, a great power behind the throne. Okay? Now, Bathsheba probably never thought she'd be in this position. But now she is. She's the queen. And she has provided sons for David. And David has already promised that Solomon's going to be the king. And David knows that's who God proves to be the king. And so who is it that the prophet sends in to David to speak to him? It's Bathsheba. And so don't ever dismiss the power of Bathsheba at this particular time in the history of the United Kingdom. Now, haven't we oftentimes heard about the power behind the throne? The closest we've ever been able to witness or study has to do with our own history and the history of our presidents. Sometimes you might read in your history books, as you study, that in the 1980s, Mrs. Reagan was the power behind the throne. A lot of people felt that way. Some people deny that, but she was obviously a very strong personality in that White House. And there are those who said she didn't cross her. Don Regan tried. What happened? He's out the door. And then some even would call Eleanor Roosevelt co-president when she was first lady. And so we just came through an election not long ago. Many thought we were going to elect the first woman president, but we didn't. But some say we've already had a woman president. 100 years ago, after President Woodrow Wilson's first wife died, Ellen, he married a woman named Edith. And then President Woodrow Wilson suffered a major stroke. And that was really hidden from the American people. President Wilson was in bad shape. And so it's now known that the one who was making a lot of the decisions was Mrs. Edith Wilson. Now today, you probably couldn't get by with that, with the press, sticking their nose into all these things, but back then it wasn't that way. But history seems to agree that Mrs. Edith Wilson was one of the most powerful first ladies, and that even made decisions on behalf of her husband, who was paralyzed in some sense. And so she really was the power behind the throne. Now we have a very weak and frail King David. Who's the power behind the throne? It is Bathsheba. Plus, wasn't Bathsheba related to somebody else that was pretty close to David at one time? Maybe like Ahithophel? That being the case, old Ahithophel was pretty known for his keen intellect. Ahithophel is one of the conspirators. I mean, do you think anything ever really bothered David, besides Absalom, anything bothered David more than what happened with his trusted advisor and friend Ahithophel? Mine own familiar friend. And that's a double prophecy there, isn't it? Because it would be related to Ahithophel. Here's what the psalmist said about that. You remember, yea, mine own familiar friend in whom I trusted, who did eat of my bread, hath lifted up his heel against me. Psalm 41, 9. And so we know that that is also applied to what New Testament character? Judas Iscariot. Interestingly, with Ahithophel, he would later do what? Take his life. Judas would later do what? Take his life. With the exception of war, the exception of battle, only two that are recorded to have taken their lives was Ahithophel and Judas. Psalm 41:9. And so we remember Ahithophel being one of those conspirators against David. And here is Bathsheba, who's now in the palace, and she is a power behind David's throne. And so it is that she brings to the attention of David what Adonijah has now done. Now, Bathsheba, she's obviously had some influence over Solomon. But I don't think her influence over Solomon could be compared to the influence that David has over his son. Now remember, David engaged in serious sin. Went after a married woman who had a faithful, loyal husband who was out on the battlefield, brought him in to try to cover the sin, then sent him back out to the battlefield so he'd die. And that's a dark moment in the life of King David, isn't it? And yet we know this, that David was forgiven of his sin with Bathsheba. He was allowed to remain on the throne. He suffered grave consequences because of what happened. But nevertheless, David was a great man. And with the birth of Solomon in those years that followed, there was some peace that came to David, no doubt. He loved Solomon. God loved Solomon. And God had a plan for Solomon. And so David trained him in the way of the Lord. Now, as David trains Solomon, he teaches his son about God. And in 1 Chronicles 28:9 we read, Know thou the God of thy father, and serve him with a perfect heart and with a willing mind. There's a good Father's Day sermon sometime, isn't it? What kind of fathers do we want to be? Fathers that teach our sons and our daughters to know God and to know Him as Father, to serve Him with a perfect heart and with a willing mind. Now, David took that training, Solomon took that training he received from his father, and then took that prayer to God when he became king, and the prayer pleased God. And so I think about the influence of David upon his life, the life of Solomon. Nathan, no doubt, had an influence upon this young man. Nathan was a great prophet of God. And one of those boys born to David and Bathsheba was named Nathan. And so Nathan had a good influence. And so I don't know how about the influence of Bathsheba. She loved Solomon with a motherly love. We know that because there she is saying to King David, listen, there's a rebellion going on. You say Solomon's going to be king. You need to declare it. And then you have the influence of King David upon his son, who was loyal to his father. As he came of age, he loved his father, learned from his father. And then you have such individuals as Nathan the prophet. Well, David, here in 1 Kings 1, will listen to what the queen has to say. And he'll do something about it. Let's notice, beginning in verse 28 of 1 Kings chapter 1, King David answered after Bathsheba came into him and told him what was happening. King David said, Call me Bathsheba. And she came to the king's presence and stood before the king. And the king sware and said, As the Lord liveth, and hath redeemed my soul out of all distress, even as I swear unto thee by the Lord God of Israel, saying, Assuredly Solomon thy son shall reign after me, and he shall sit upon my throne in my stead. Even so will I certainly do this day. And then Bathsheba bowed her face to the earth. She did reverence to the king and said, Let my Lord King David live forever. Now, David then calls upon three of his most trusted advisors. He has here Zadok the priest, he's got Nathan the prophet, and Benaiah, who was the son of Jehoiada, and Benaiah, of course, one of David's mighty men. And what did he tell them? You go out here and you anoint Solomon to be the king, and let all of Israel know about this. And so that's what he would do. They would anoint Solomon the king. Now, Solomon is a very young age when this happened, and he is a man who has gained the trust of his father. The Lord respects him at this particular time. Soon after he was anointed the king, you remember, it's when he went to Gibeon, and he stood there at the altar in the tabernacle, and he offered up that beautiful prayer unto God, found over in 1 Kings chapter 3 and verse 4. Let's notice that prayer that he prayed again, just to keep before us the righteousness and the godliness that was found in the life of the king. The king went to Gibeon to sacrifice there, for there was a great high place. 1,000 burnt offerings did Solomon offer upon that altar. And in Gibeon the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream by night. God didn't often appear to Solomon, but he did appear on this occasion. And God says, ask what I shall give thee. And Solomon made that request. Thou hast showed of thy servant David, my father, great mercy, according as he has walked before thee in truth and in righteousness and uprightness of heart with thee. And thou hast kept for him this great kindness. Thou hast given him a son to sit on his throne as it is this day. And now, O Lord my God, thou hast made thy servant king instead of David my father. And I am but a little child. I know not how to go out or come in. Now, here he demonstrates great what? Humility, doesn't he? Humility. I don't know how to do this. Thy servant is in the midst of thy people, which thou hast chosen, a great people, that cannot be numbered nor counted in multitude. Give therefore thy servant an understanding heart to judge thy people, that I may discern between good and bad. For who is able to judge this so great a people? And the speech pleased the Lord that Solomon asked this thing. How often do you hear a prayer called a speech, right? But the text says that it was a speech that Solomon made before the Lord, one that pleased God. Okay, here we see him starting out his reign, and he's doing all right, isn't he? And the Lord appeared to him again. Of course, it seems to me when the Lord would appear to him again, he'd say something similar, but also he'd remind him, don't you turn away from me. I don't know when that happened, if already the Lord was seeing something happening in his heart, I don't know. But anyway, we know this, that glorious days were ahead for King Solomon. All right? Glorious days ahead for King Solomon. But then, as he got older, something happened to his heart. Now, let's think about this just for a moment, because what happened to Solomon was different from what happened to David. David was a good man, but he was overwhelmed by fleshly lust at a particular moment, wasn't he? And he gave in to the temptation of the flesh, and that led him to do many things there, to cover it up, things that were atrocious. And finally it took Nathan the prophet coming to David, and David finally being willing to repent and confess what he'd done. Now, what's happening to Solomon is different, though. This is happening over a period of time, isn't it? Something is happening over a long period of time that gradually, that's turning Solomon against the Lord. And the Lord, of course, knows it. And then, of course, we get to chapter 11, and this is where we stopped studying. Back, earlier this year, I guess, whenever we changed subjects from the United Kingdom to something else. Now we're coming back to this period again. But you get to chapter 11 and verse 1. King Solomon loved many strange women, strange here being foreign women, and together with the daughter of Pharaoh, women of the Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Zidonians, Hittites, of the nations concerning which the Lord said to the children of Israel, ye shall not go in to them, neither shall they come in unto you, for surely they will turn away your heart after their gods. Solomon clave unto these in love. All right? Now God had said to Moses, when there's a king one day, they better not be relying upon military strength. having an abundance of what? Horses and chariots and all that. Better not do that. And already done that. All right, already done that. And they better not be. Marrying foreign women, because that's going to rend the kingdom from whoever is the king. And now you see Solomon doing that. And so one of the reasons why that Solomon went after these strange women, evidently he became very sensual, very promiscuous, but that might not have been the only reason. One reason I think that Solomon was going after these strange women was because that's also how he made alliances with other nations, wasn't it? And that's how he well established himself as king. What do they call Queen Victoria? The grandmother of Europe, right? 9 children born to Queen Victoria and Prince Albert. And those 9 children, except for the heir or the first couple of oldest boys stayed in England, the rest of them married off to other European royal households. And why is that done? It's to build your power. And just think about how Solomon must have appeared to the idolatrous nations of the world when during this time he was prospering and he had this mighty army, he's making all these alliances, and he had this harem of women, right? Some 700 wives, 300 concubines who worked on behalf of the wives. Somebody said that's 1,000 mothers-in-law. I didn't say that. Somebody else did. And so I don't know how this could have been a good thing. It wasn't a good thing. And of course, God was very disappointed. And so here we have the wisest and the richest and most powerful king who ever lived, who has done what? He's fallen. He has fallen from the relationship that he once had with God. The great kingdom which had been given unto him because of his father David is disappearing, and God says, I'm going to rend the kingdom from you. And the only reason it wouldn't happen in Solomon's time was for whose sake? David's sake, wasn't it? And so we might ask ourselves sometimes, how could a man so endowed with such high intellect and wisdom, how could he allow his heart to be turned away to follow these other gods? Now keep in mind, this was a gradual thing. And keep in mind that he also continued to say, I believe in the God of heaven, who's the God of Israel, right? What's happening, though, is what's being intermingled with the worship to God is all this idolatrous worship. And he's giving in to these wives and saying, look what I've done for you now. Here's your place to go worship your God, Ashtaroth, and all those false gods from these other heathen nations. And so he's just giving in to them. And so all around the countryside, you see these places that are being used for idol worship. And so what's happened here? Well, 2 things come to mind. 2 things particularly. One thing is this. Solomon proves that we're free moral agents, doesn't he? A free moral agency. Solomon, despite all of his wisdom, still had to make up his mind whether or not he was going to be faithful to God. So to make a difference, a king or a slave, you have free moral agency. But something else is this. Solomon didn't make wise use of the gifts God gave him. Is it necessarily a good thing for us to be blessed with enormous wealth? Not necessarily. I've known some of the greatest servants of God who were individuals with wealth. And one area where it's right to be liberal is in giving, isn't it? And they would give to the cause of Christ. But far too often what happens with material wealth is a dependency upon self, and it takes the heart away from God. So here you have Solomon, who is considered the wisest man to ever live, yet still a man who is a free moral agent, whose conscience obviously has become dull, and he's also a man who has been given so many gifts that God wanted him to have. You think God wants to bless us? I do. Sometimes we don't know how to use those blessings that God gives us. And so here we find that he is no longer doing what God required and God desired. And that is what was in his prayer initially, to serve God alone. And so again, his defection was not the result of just one particular act, as it was with his father, but it was something that was gradual, something he probably didn't even see happening. It was so slow. Well, we also come to this passage in verse 4 of chapter 11. Notice, it came to pass when Solomon was old. And through my studies, I've learned that means he's probably about 55. When Solomon was old, that his wives turned away his heart after the gods, and his heart was not perfect with the Lord his God, as was the heart of David his father. So see, there's a difference here, right? We've studied about David's sin, but there's a difference in David and Solomon. And so his heart's not like his daddy. And here we have verse 6 saying, Solomon did evil in the sight of the Lord, and went not fully after the Lord as David his father. He has started to compromise. And so he took these foreign wives. Now these foreign wives have turned his heart away from God. And so what happens? Well, God is now, quote, angry with Solomon. Now, when God gets angry, that doesn't mean God sins. God can't do that. But he can be filled with what? Righteous indignation. And he is over what has happened with Solomon. Verses 9 through 11 of 1 Kings. Jehovah was angry with Solomon because his heart was turned away from Jehovah. And the God of Israel, who had appeared unto him twice and had commanded him concerning this thing, that he should not go after the gods, but he kept not that which Jehovah commanded. Wherefore Jehovah said unto Solomon, Forasmuch as this is done of thee, and thou hast not kept my covenant and my statutes which I have commanded thee, I will surely rend the kingdom from thee, and will give it to thy servant. So now what's God saying? You didn't do what I told you to do. For your father's David's sake, you'll stay on the throne. But when you're gone, it's over. And so it is that despite the fact that Solomon asked God to give him wisdom, and God gave it, despite the fact that he demonstrated that great wisdom to the extent that the people of the world stood astonished, and despite the fact that he did what God allowed him to do, and to build that wonderful temple, and despite the fact that the Queen of Sheba came and was so impressed, she said the half has not even been told. Here we have a man who had honored God, who served God. Now, as life comes to an end, he is turning away from God, and these foreign wives have done this. And so, when we consider why this happened, it happened the way it always does. Lust of the flesh, lust of the eyes, and pride of life all came together, didn't it? And it destroyed King Solomon. So now, the kingdom is going to be divided. And that begins our study of what we call the divided kingdom. And so we're going to start that next week, because we're out of time.
Thank you, Brother Jim.
Brother.